This story is based on real historical records, survivor testimonies, and documented wartime archives.
I was 19 years old and a student at the University of California at Berkeley when I was called into the Army in January 1944. I had wanted to be a combat pilot. I had imagined it the way young men imagine things. Not the reality of it, but the shape of it. The idea of flying, of being high above the thing instead of standing in it. The Army had other plans. I was routed to infantry training at Fort Benning, Georgia. A 19-year-old black man from California at Fort Benning, Georgia in 1944. If you understand what that sentence contains, you understand something about the education that preceded my actual combat education. From Fort Benning, I was assigned to the 3rd Battalion, 370th Infantry Regiment, 92nd Infantry Division. The division's nickname was the Buffalo Soldiers, taken from the 19th century black cavalry regiments that had earned the name, it was said, from the Native American warriors they had fought. The name had passed down through the decades as a matter of pride. The shoulder patch was a black buffalo on a green field. You wore it knowing what it meant, knowing where it came from, and knowing what the Army expected it to mean, which was something different and smaller. The 92nd was the only black infantry division to see combat in Europe during the entire Second World War. Fort Huachuca was located in the southeastern corner of Arizona, 15 miles north of the Mexican border, in a stretch of desert that had been used to house black troops since the 19th century. The Army had selected it for this purpose specifically because of its remoteness. No congressional delegation wanted an armed black division training near their constituency. No governor wanted it in their state, so the desert was used, because the desert had no senators. The division's commanding general was Major General Edward M. Almond, a Virginia native and graduate of the Virginia Military Institute, a man who had been appointed to command the 92nd because Army leadership believed, in the words of the strategic thinking of the time, that a Southern man would know how to manage Negro soldiers. Almond was 51 years old when he took command, and he would hold it through the entire Italian campaign. He was not shy about his views. Addressing one of his regiments before deployment, he said, "I did not send for you. Your Negro newspapers, Negro politicians, and white friends have insisted on your seeing combat, and I shall see that you get combat and your share of casualties." He kept his word on both counts. The white officers of the 92nd were, with few exceptions, men from the South, selected for the same reason Almond had been selected. The men they commanded were largely black soldiers from the South as well, from states where the educational system available to black children had been deliberately and systematically starved. Many of the enlisted men carried Army classification ratings of I, V, and V, the lowest categories. Not because they lacked intelligence, but because no one had provided them with adequate education, and the Army's tests measured what education had been provided. 3/4 of them came from southern states. The Army activated the division before the educational remediation programs it had designed even got underway. This was the machinery. The white officers did not believe the black soldiers would fight. The black soldiers knew the white officers did not believe they would fight. Both groups understood this clearly, and both groups had to operate inside it every day. The historian Daniel Gabron, who later studied the division's combat record in depth, identified what was at the root of the 92nd's difficulties: segregation combined with apathy and distrust. And then, underneath all of that, the leadership, meaning Almond and the officers he had selected, and the system of belief they carried with them into the field. A. William Perry, who served with the 92nd's 370th Regiment, put it simply in a recorded interview decades after the war. "I don't think they particularly liked us. And we returned that thing in spades. On July 15th, 1944, I boarded the SS Mariposa at Newport News, Virginia, along with 7,000 other men of the 92nd Infantry. The voyage to Naples took 2 weeks. We arrived on July 28th. Italy was nothing I had prepared for. Not the landscape, the hills rising sharply behind the coast. The stone towns built into slopes that any military man could see were designed by God for defensive warfare. terraces of olive trees and vineyards, leading up to ridge lines, where any German commander worth a name would put his guns. I had not prepared for the Italians either, or for how they looked at us when we marched through their towns. Perry described it. Italy was the first place in his service career he actually felt welcome. General Clark, commanding the Fifth Army, had promoted one of the 92nd's officers on the spot when he arrived. The Italian civilians came out to see us, and their faces were something else. Something that had not been on any face in any American town we had trained in. We were fighting to free people who treated us better than our own country did. I want you to sit with that sentence for a moment. The arithmetic of this was something the men of the 92nd understood without needing to calculate it. At home, in the southern states where most of them had grown up, there were laws. Laws about which restaurants you could enter, which seats on public transportation you were permitted to take, which doors you could walk through in the buildings that your taxes had built. Those laws were enforced, not abstractly enforced by the daily fact of understanding what happened to men who violated them. In Italy, in the towns along the Tyrrhenian coast, the Italian civilians came out of their damaged houses and stood by the road and watched the 92nd pass, and looked at the men with something in their eyes that the men had not seen directed at them before. Not all Italians were this way. Not every moment was like this. But enough of them were, and enough moments were, that men noticed it. William Perry noticed it. He said Italy was the first place he actually felt welcome. The question that this created, the question of what you were fighting for and who you were fighting for, was one the men could not afford to stop and answer. You answered it by fighting. You answered it by the daily work of being a soldier on the Italian front in the autumn and winter of 1944, which was exhausting and dangerous and specific enough to crowd out any room for the larger questions. The questions came at night sometimes, in the foxhole, in the dark. In the daylight you were too busy staying alive. The objective was a crossing of the Arno River. No member of Combat Team 370 ever forgot that night. We were 4,000 men, mostly Southern Negroes of modest education. As Ivan Houston wrote, and a smaller number of college men like himself, 19 years old, knowing that everything we did would be reported and measured and used to determine whether black men were capable of fighting. The normal press of war was there, the fear and the darkness and the enemy positions across the water. But there was this other weight, too. Every mistake would be attributed not to us individually, but to all of us. Every retreat would be used as evidence of something that Armand had already decided was true before we ever crossed the ocean. We crossed the Arno and we fought. That is what the record shows. The Italian front was not like France or the Pacific, which had large sweeping movements of armor and infantry across open ground. Italy was hills. Italy was mountains. The Gothic Line, the German defensive position that ran across the top of the Italian peninsula, was built into terrain that would have been difficult to assault even with perfect conditions. Perfect equipment, perfect leadership. We had none of those things in perfect supply. The hills were serious things, not metaphorical hills or the gentle rises of training ground in Arizona. Hills built from limestone and clay, with narrow mule tracks for roads, where pack animals were more useful than jeeps, and where a machine gun position 100 meters up the slope had absolute command of everything below it. The Germans had been defending Italy for over a year by the time the 92nd arrived. They knew the terrain the way men know the interior of a house they have lived in all their lives. Every corner, every angle, every approach. They had had months to build. Concrete pillboxes on ridge lines, wire in the draws, minefields on every path that led anywhere worth going. The Gothic Line itself was not one continuous wall, but a system of mutually supporting positions stretching 50 miles from coast to coast. And the piece of it that faced the 92nd was some of the most difficult ground on the whole Italian front. In autumn, the rain came, and it did not stop in any meaningful way until spring. The roads became mud that swallowed vehicles whole. The foxholes filled with water. Men lived in them anyway, because the alternative was to live in the open, where the German artillery could find you on the bare hillsides. By December, the rain had turned to snow, and the mountains behind the coast were white, and the cold came down into the valleys at night and did not leave during the day. The men of the 92nd had trained in a desert. They had arrived in August when Italy was beautiful. By November, Italy was none of those things. What we had was the Italian terrain, which gave no advantages to the attacker, and a commander who had decided before deployment that his soldiers were inferior, and an army that had trained us in a desert in Arizona while other divisions went to war. And we had the knowledge, each of us carrying it like weight, that when we advanced and took ground and held it, Congress would not celebrate it. The newspapers that covered the 92nd focused on every withdrawal, every loss, and broadcast it home as evidence. Black soldiers couldn't fight. The 92nd was cracking. There is a particular kind of pressure that comes from understanding you are being watched not to succeed but to fail. An ordinary soldier carries the fear of death. A Buffalo Soldier carried that fear, and underneath it another one. The fear that if you faltered, it would be used to prove something about all black men that Almond and his officers already believed. This was not a military calculation. It was a human one. It lived in the body the way cold lives in the body, not as a thought, but as a physical fact. Rothaker C. Smith, a medical corpsman who was wounded and captured in one of the division's engagements, later said of the men around him, "After the war, I read these reports that the Buffalo men melted away in combat, but the men I watched fought with spirit and guts." The report Almond's officers wrote did not include Smith's observation. They were not designed to include observations of that kind. James Pat Doherty wrote about the weight of this in his memoir. A fellow soldier told him, "Look, bud, they don't train colored soldiers to fight. They train them to load ships, and you don't expect them to put white boys in a Negro outfit, do you? What do you think this is? A democracy or something?" Doherty had earned a Bronze Star for capturing a German prisoner during a night patrol in December 1944. He had gone ahead of the rest of his company, stumbled in darkness onto a German barrier of wooden planks and branches, caught the movement of a figure in the dark. He was being asked by a fellow soldier whether an army that awarded him a Bronze Star in Italy could not also put white soldiers into his unit. The question contained its own answer, but not the one the army was comfortable saying aloud. On October 8, 1944, Vernon Baker, a platoon leader from Cheyenne, Wyoming, who had tried to enlist in April 1941 and been told, "We don't have any quotas for you people," went on night patrol and was seriously wounded. He spent 2 months in the 64th General Hospital at Pisa before returning to his unit. When he came back in December, he found himself the senior officer in his regiment. Not by much. By the time white officers arrived in March 1945, Baker had held that position for months. On Christmas Day, 1944, the Serchio River Valley was quiet. The 92nd had been fighting in this sector since November. The terrain was mountains, rising sharply from a flat coastal plain, and the winter had arrived in full. The cold and the mud, and the rain that turned the roads into something that could swallow a truck. The men on Christmas Day were in positions they had occupied for several weeks, which, in the language of Italian campaign warfare, meant they had been there long enough to know where the enemy's guns were, and long enough to be exhausted by the knowledge. On Christmas night, German soldiers began moving into the village of Somocolonia. They came in civilian clothes. By the time morning came, the town was largely in their hands. At 4 in the morning on December 26, uniformed German formations launched a coordinated assault across the sector. American forces, significantly outnumbered, began to withdraw. First Lieutenant John R. Fox did not withdraw. Fox was 29 years old, a forward observer from Cincinnati, Ohio, an officer of the 366th Infantry Regiment attached to the 598th Field Artillery Battalion. He had graduated from Wilberforce University in 1941 with a commission and a degree in engineering. He was positioned on the second floor of a house in Somocolonia. responsible for directing artillery fire to cover the American withdrawal. He directed it. As the Germans advanced and the American positions contracted around him, Fox called his adjustments into the radio. Closer, closer. At 8 in the morning, he reported that the Germans were in the streets and attacking in strength. He called for artillery fire increasingly close to his own position. His battalion commander heard the numbers and protested. The bombardment would be too close. Fox's reply, "That was just where I wanted it. Bring it 60 yards." The barrage was fired. The Germans continued to press forward. Fox called again. His commander protested again. "Fox, that will be on you. Fox's last communication. Fire it. There's more of them than there are of us. Give them hell." When American forces counterattacked and retook Somocolonia on January 1st, 1945, they found Fox's body alongside the bodies of approximately 100 German soldiers. His action, at the cost of his own life, had delayed the German advance long enough for American forces to reorganize and for Italian civilians to escape. Fox was not recommended for any decoration at the time of his death. In 1982, after a Pentagon review, he received the Distinguished Service Cross. In 1997, after a study commissioned by the Army found that not a single black soldier from World War II had ever been nominated for the Medal of Honor, not because of any shortage of qualifying actions, but because of the racism that determined whose valor was recorded and recognized. Fox was awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously. He received it 53 years after he earned it. By early 1945, after the failures of Operation Fourth Term, the February offensive that cost over 1,100 casualties against the Gothic Line, General Alman's response was to produce a formal report blaming the soldiers. His officers joined him. The report, later described by historians as probably the only instance in American military history where all of the top commanders of a division placed blame for failure completely on their soldiers rather than accepting responsibility themselves, attributed to the division's difficulties to the inherent limitations of black men in combat. It did not mention that the orders in the assessment of Lieutenant Frederick Davison was so flawed, so inept, that there was no way that success could have been achieved. It did not mention Alman's consistent failure to recognize acts of individual heroism, or his pattern of demanding the impossible from men he had publicly stated were inferior. It blamed the men. The men kept fighting. On April 5th, 1945, less than a month before Germany's surrender, Vernon Baker's platoon moved out at 0500 hours toward Castello Aginolfi, a German stronghold near Viareggio. 70% of the men under Baker's command were replacements with no previous combat experience. They had been sent into one of the most difficult assaults of the Italian campaign, with a majority of untested soldiers. Baker brought them to within 250 yards of the objective in 2 hours. He had grown up learning to shoot from his grandfather, who taught him to hunt because the family needed food after Baker's parents died when he was 4 years old. He brought that skill up the hills of Italy and he used it. He found 2 German soldiers in an observation post and killed them. He found 2 more near a camouflaged machine gun and killed them. He destroyed 6 enemy machine gun positions, 4 dugouts, 2 observation posts, 2 abandoned command posts. He severed the telephone cables he found. He fought his way toward the castle with the specific practical economy of a man who has always had to provide his own way. His commander was ordered to withdraw. Baker covered the retreat. He was among the last to fall back from the hill. He had just come back from 2 months in a hospital, and 70% of his men had never fired at an enemy before. On July 4th, 1945, Baker received the Distinguished Service Cross in a ceremony near Viareggio. The white officers at the ceremony received lesser decorations that day. They occupied the place of honor in the ceremony's arrangement. In 1997, Baker's Distinguished Service Cross was upgraded to the Medal of Honor, the only one ever awarded to a black soldier for service in World War II, to a man who lived to receive it. Baker was the last surviving recipient, Clinton placed it around his neck at the White House. Baker's response, when asked about it, "I was a soldier, and I had a job to do." He had always been a soldier, and he had always had a job to do. The country took 52 years to acknowledge that job at the level it deserved. Baker was living in the mountains of Idaho, working for the Red Cross, when they finally called. The war in Italy ended on May 2, 1945. The 92nd Infantry Division had suffered by that point almost 3,000 casualties. Killed, wounded, missing. 330 men killed in action. 2,215 wounded, 616 missing. The division's campaign had taken it from the Arno River in August 1944 to Genoa by April 27, 1945. 100 miles of Italian coastline, from the heat of late summer to the snow of the Apennine winter, through the Serchio Valley and up the Gothic Line, and finally into the breaking German lines of spring. When the division came home, the Army's own assessment of what black soldiers were capable of remained what Almond had shaped it to be. The man who had told his troops they would get their share of casualties, who had attributed every failure to their race and none to his own leadership, would be promoted to lieutenant general. He would later command American forces in Korea. I was 20 years old when the war ended. I had gone in as a 19-year-old student from Berkeley who wanted to fly. I came home as a sergeant major who had fought through the winter mountains of northern Italy with a combat infantryman's badge and a Bronze Star and a Purple Heart. I came home to a country that still, officially, did not believe I had been worth sending to fight. 3 years later, President Truman desegregated the armed forces. Not because they decided it was right, because the Buffalo Soldiers had made it impossible to keep pretending otherwise.